I was reading a blog this week about a book that was published 5 or 6 years ago, and the book was called The Island of the Lost Maps. It was written by a guy named Miles Harvey, and in the book he tells the mostly true story of a map thief named Gilbert Bland. And Bland would travel across America and visit libraries and cut valuable maps out of antique books, and then he would sell those maps. And Miles Harvey, as he was telling about what motivated him as an author to tell this story of a thief who stole maps, here's what he says. He says, in my 30s, I spent a great deal of time at a traveler's cafe in Chicago whose walls were adorned with masks from Bali and whose shelves were filled with maps and guides of far-flung destinations. He says, at that time, I was the literary critic for the magazine Outside Magazine. It was a great job, but one that was beginning to wear on my patience. He says, the books I read were all about people who did things like climb the Himalayan mountains, or rode a bicycle across Africa, or sailed wooden boats across the Atlantic, or tracked into restricted areas of China. And he says, these tales of adventure filled my days and my imagination, yet my own life was anything but adventurous. He writes, the interior of the coffee shop was ringed with clocks, each one showing the time of some distant locale. And as I watched the weeks ticking away in these distant places, I began to long for an adventure of my own. You reach a place where you get tired of reading other people's stories. You want to be able to tell your own story. You get tired of just looking at maps. At some point, you want to go visit the place. And he says that he reminded himself of a character in Joseph Conrad's novel who would look at maps and would say, when I grow up, I'll go there. Someday, I'm going to go there. And for many of us, we can resonate with that feeling of sitting in a coffee shop and seeing other people's adventures and wanting an adventure of our own. We become content to just look at maps and say, someday I'll go there. Well, why not today? Well, today's not a really good day. It's busy right now, but someday I'll go there. Someday I'm going to be more intentional with my marriage. I know what kind of husband I want to be. I know what kind of wife God wants me to be. And someday I'm going to go there, but right now there's just a lot going on. Now, someday I'm going to go there as a parent. Someday I'm going to go there in my neighborhood and in my community. Someday I'm going to accept a challenge to really serve and love where I am. Someday I'm going to do that. But right now there's just a lot of responsibilities. It's just difficult for me right now because there's so much happening, a lot on my plate. We have all kinds of reasons why we become content for life in the coffee shop. We become content to stare at maps rather than to go on an adventure. And it seems to mark our culture more and more. If you look at the amount of hours we spend watching reality TV, it's pretty staggering. And so people will say, hey, I don't really have time to engage in this or in that, but if you engage them in some kind of conversation about The Voice or American Idol or Keeping Up with the Kardashians or The Bachelor or Dancing with the Stars, then they're very knowledgeable. And we don't see the irony, right? That we can spend so much time watching other people live their lives that we are missing out on an opportunity to live a life and to live our own adventure. And so for all of you who begin this year sitting in the coffee shop staring at maps, what we want to do in the next 4 weeks is invite you to go on an adventure with God. The series we're calling Next is a challenge to you, to all of us, to take the next step in our journey of faith. Because without meaning to, we can become quite content just trying to maintain the status quo, just staying where we've been spiritually. And for some of us, you can look back maybe a year or 2 or 5 or 10 years and nothing's really changed. Like you've not really been challenged in any dramatic way. There hasn't been any story really worth telling. You've just kind of gone along day to day, week to week. And what we would love to do is to be a church full of explorers that accept the invitation to go on this adventure with God. One of the ways that we're trying to help engage this as a church is through our Love Where You Are groups. And there are groups meeting all around this community. No doubt there's a group meeting close to where you live. And we're asking you to join a Love Where You Are group so that we can not just come to church and sit and listen, but that we can really live this out. We can put the maps away and go on an adventure. And so if you haven't signed up for one of those groups, we'd love for you to do that this weekend. But we don't want to be people who just read others' stories. We want to be able to tell our own. So what I want us to do in the next few minutes is look at the invitation that Jesus gives the disciples to go on an adventure with him, to follow him. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the same story from two different accounts. We're going to look at it from Matthew's perspective, and we're going to see what Luke has to say about it. Same story, but two different perspectives. Matthew chapter 4, we're going to spend some time there. Then we'll flip over and look at Luke chapter 4 and 5 as Jesus invites the disciples to take this next step to follow him. So just some context here. Matthew is writing to a mostly Jewish audience. Because of that, there's a lot he can leave out. There's some cultural assumptions that he can make because his audience understands the perspective that he's writing from. There's some things he doesn't need to include. So when Matthew tells about the calling of the disciples, what you'll notice is it's a pretty succinct version, just a few sentences long, really. And then Luke's going to give us more detail. But here's what Matthew says about when Jesus called the disciples to follow him. It says, one day, verse 18, one day, as Jesus was walking along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, also called Peter, and Andrew, throwing a net into the water, for they fished for a living. And Jesus called out to them, "Come, follow me, and I'll show you how to fish for people." Verse 20 says, they left their nets at once, or immediately, and they followed him. A little farther up the shore, he saw two other brothers, James and John, sitting in a boat with their father, Zebedee, repairing their nets, and he called them to come too. And they immediately followed him, and leaving the boat and their father behind. So when we read this from Matthew's perspective, here's what it looks like. And this is maybe the way some of you grew up thinking about this moment, that Jesus just kind of randomly shows up on the scene. They don't really know who he is, but he says, "Follow me," and they're like, okay. I mean, we don't really know who you are. We don't know what you're about, but good luck with the fishing business, Dad. Tell Mom we said bye, and they just go and follow him. That's what it appears to be in Matthew's account. It appears that they were somewhat impulsive, maybe even irresponsible in accepting the invitation to follow Jesus. But a lot of us grew up thinking that's how it works. That Jesus says, "Follow me," and there's really no room for questions, and there's really no opportunity to explore. You're either in or you're out, right? You go one way or the other. Just, I mean, if you want to go to heaven, you better say yes. And so we had this idea that it was just this blind decision to say, I'm going to follow Jesus, but there was not any exploration. There wasn't any room for questioning. But Luke writes the same story, tells us the same story, but he gives us a lot of details leading up to it. Because while Matthew wrote to a Jewish audience, Luke wrote to a Gentile audience. And he knows that the Gentiles are going to be skeptical. They don't understand the rabbinical approach to teaching, where the followers would leave behind their life as they knew it and follow a rabbi and learn from the rabbi. The Gentiles didn't get that. So they were going to have more questions. They were going to be more cynical. And so Luke explains, and in fact, he begins his account, his gospel account in Luke chapter 1 by saying, that essentially he knows his readers are going to be a little bit cynical. He says, many people have set out, this is verse 1, many people have set out to write accounts about the events that have been fulfilled among us, and they use the eyewitness report circulating among us from the early disciples. Having carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I also have decided to write a careful account, an orderly account for you, most honorable Theophilus, so that you can be certain of the truth of everything you were taught. So what's Luke saying? He's saying, look, I've explored these things. I didn't just write down what other people told me to write down. I heard what they said, first person experience, and then I investigated it carefully, and I've written them down in an orderly manner. And he knows that the people he is going to be writing to are going to be coming at it with some cynicism. And so Luke's going to tell us the same story about Jesus calling the disciples, but he's going to give us context. He's going to help lead us into it. And so before telling us about the calling of the disciples in Luke 5, Luke tells us in chapter 4, verse 14, that Jesus has already been teaching in the area. It says reports about Jesus spread quickly through the whole region. He taught regularly in their synagogues, was praised by everyone. So Luke makes the point that before Jesus even calls the disciples would have known who he was. They would have been familiar with the reputation of this unconventional rabbi that was an incredible teacher. Luke also tells us in chapter 4 that before Jesus calls the disciples that he casts out a demon. And verse 36 says, amazed, the people exclaimed, what authority and power this man's word possesses. Even evil spirits obey him, and they flee at his command. And the news about Jesus spread through every village in the entire region. So the disciples knew that Jesus had incredible authority, incredible power, that even demons believed or obeyed him. And so before setting out on this adventure with Jesus, they had an opportunity to explore who Jesus was, what he was about. Chapter 4 ends and says, so Jesus continued to travel around preaching in synagogues throughout Judea. So here's what I want you to catch, is that sometimes the journey of faith is described as kind of a path where there's no room for questions. You just have to blindly follow. And if you have doubts, you better keep those to yourself. And if you have questions, then, don't ask those out loud. Just get in line and just follow. Sometimes it's portrayed that way, but Luke shows us something different, and John does as well, that when Jesus called the disciples, he gave them opportunity to explore. In fact, in the Gospel of John, the invitation of Jesus is to come and see. Come see for yourself, investigate, explore this. And so in chapter 5, Luke's going to tell us the same story as Matthew, but he's going to give us a little bit more detail. It's not contradictory, but it's a little more in depth. So here's what Luke says, chapter 5. It says, one day Jesus was preaching on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. So Matthew said Jesus was on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Luke says, yeah, and he was also preaching. Matthew left that out. Great crowds pressed in on him and to listen to the word of God. And Jesus noticed 2 empty boats at the water's edge, for the fishermen had left them and were washing their nets. And stepping into one of the boats, Jesus asked Simon, its owner, to push out into the water. And so he sat in the boat and he taught the crowds from there. The water was a way to naturally amplify the voice of Jesus as he taught. And so you kind of picture the scene. You got Jesus in a boat with Peter and probably Peter's brother Andrew, and they're sitting there watching Jesus as he teaches the crowd on the shore. Verse 4, when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, now I want you to go where it is deeper and let down your nets to catch some fish. Verse 5, Master, Simon replied, we worked all night and we didn't catch anything. You hear what he's saying? We've already done this. We've already tried to catch fish. And by the way, you're a carpenter. And I'm a fisherman. Like that's what it says on my business card. I know what I'm doing. I've been doing this my whole life. I know how to fish. You're telling me to go out and fish, but I've already been fit. This isn't the time of day to fish. That's not the place you want to go fish. And yet he says to Jesus, but because you've said, because you say so, I'll do it. I'll let down the nets again. Verse 6 says, at this time their nets were so full of fish they began to tear, and a shout for help brought their partners in the other boat, and soon both boats were filled with fish and on the verge of sinking. When Simon Peter realized what had happened, he fell to his knees before Jesus and said, "Oh Lord, please leave me. I'm too much of a sinner to be around you." For he was awestruck by the number of fish that they had caught, as were the others with him. His partners, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, were also amazed. And Jesus replied to Simon, to Peter, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you'll be fishing for people." And as soon as they landed, they left everything and they followed Jesus. So do you see the difference between Matthew's account and Luke's account? I mean, what Matthew said was technically right, but what Luke includes makes a lot more sense for those of us who tend to be a little more skeptical. That the disciples had time to explore, to learn, to discover. They had time to personally encounter the power of Jesus in their life. And then they took that next step and they left their nets, they followed him. So as we begin this new year, the question I would like all of us to kind of engage is this question of what is my next step in my journey with Jesus? What's the next step for me? And for each of us, there's an answer to that question, right? Like no matter where you're at in your faith journey, there's a next step that needs to be taken. And so one of the things that we discover is that as we follow Jesus, it calls us to continually have this identity as an explorer. No matter where you're at in your faith, there should be an exploration of faith. Exploring involves, we see, learning, and it involves discovery. So you see this with the disciples early on, and that continues to be true throughout following Jesus. Peter and the disciples, they listened to the teaching of Jesus. They had time to discover what he was about, and they personally encountered his truth. And so when Jesus asked to teach from Peter's boat, Peter explored. He didn't say, well, it's not really a good time for me right now, and I'm really tired, and there's a big game on tonight, so I'm going to have to pass on this. No, he took an opportunity to discover a little bit more, to explore if Jesus really knew what he was talking about. And so this is a step that I really would love to challenge some of you to take. I know that I'm talking to some people, at least, that have been coming to church for a little while, and you've learned a little bit about Jesus, and yet there are these questions that you have that are holding you back spiritually. You're struggling with these questions, and they're good questions, but you don't feel like you can ask them. Questions like, how do you reconcile the goodness of God with the suffering in this world? How do you reconcile a loving God with the doctrine of hell? It's good questions. Questions, that maybe have come to the surface since you went away to school and you had some professor who raised a lot of doubts in your faith. And those questions are there, but instead of asking them, instead of feeling free to explore those questions, you hide behind them. In some ways, you're afraid of an answer, because if those questions get answered, then suddenly there are very real implications for your life and for your purpose. And it's almost easier. It's almost easier to not know the answer to the questions, to not actually explore. It's almost easier to just say, well, I believe, but there's all these questions I have, and I'm just going to kind of hide behind these questions. It's more comfortable behind those questions. But the invitation is to explore, to take the next step. And one of the things that I've discovered over the years is that people will hide behind these questions, and then they don't either feel free to explore or they don't want to explore. And so I might say to someone who has a question about faith, it's a good question, I'll say, hey, good question. I'd love for you to take a look at a couple of books, and I might recommend a book or two for them to read. Or I might say, hey, here's a lecture that you might want to listen to, or here's a debate on YouTube that you might want to pull up. And what I've discovered is that more times than not, that never happens. Like, I'll run into the person later, hey, did you read the books? No. Did you take some time? I'd love to hear your observation about what you read. I have. It's been really busy. I just haven't had time. I'm going to pick those up, but I haven't yet. Okay. Well, what about the lecture? Did you have time to listen to the lecture, the YouTube video, that debate that I sent you? You know what? I haven't had time to watch that YouTube debate. I've watched The Evolution of Dance 75 times, but I haven't had time to actually watch that YouTube debate. And so what happens is we act like we have these big questions and these big doubts, but we don't want to explore. Maybe because we're afraid of what we'll find, maybe because we don't feel like we have the freedom to ask the questions, but my challenge for you is to take that next step. Don't hide behind those. Jesus welcomes them. He's not afraid of them. When the disciple Thomas questioned the resurrection of Christ, Jesus didn't say, Thomas, you just have to believe. No, he invited Thomas to examine himself. He said, look, Thomas, put your hand on my hands, feel my scars, and put your hand in my side. And then he said to Thomas, stop doubting and believe. But this is not just a step for people who are kind of at the beginning of their faith journey. This is also a step for those of you who've been a follower of Jesus for many years, that exploring should be a continued commitment that we make. My dad was a seminary professor and a seminary president for more than 30 years. And for the last 10 years or so, he's been the preacher pastor of a church in Evansville, Indiana. But last week he sent me an email, and he was excited to tell me about some things that God had been teaching him. And I just want to read to you what he wrote to me. He said, son, I have to tell you about a book I just read called Unoffendable. It makes the point that Jesus was never personally offended, and this is something I have completely overlooked and I've really needed to think about. Now, when I'm reading this, almost immediately what strikes me is my dad is one of the least offendable people I know. It's very difficult to offend my father, and yet this is an area where he feels like God is teaching me, and he goes on to say, he says, for all of my life, I've been offended by a particular kind of person. The person who bullies others, who torments the helpless, the person who intimidates those who are weak, the person who victimizes the defenseless. As you know, when it comes to people like this, I'm looking for a fight. I'm afraid this is something that I've passed on to you, but I can see now that I have shown very little grace to this type of person. I have too often behaved, he writes, like Peter in the garden, and with noble intentions, I pull out the sword and I take off an ear, determined that I'm going to set things right and I'm going to fix things. And yet Jesus took time to tenderly reattach the ear. And so God has been teaching me, and I feel very free and at peace, that God can be trusted to set things right. I am beginning to understand Romans 12:19, where God says, it's mine to avenge and I will repay. So God is teaching me that more often I need to back off, put away my sword, and stay out of his business. As I grow older, he writes, I am determined to show more love, patience, and grace in the face of offense and injustice.